Welcome to GovCon Unscripted, where we dive into the unfiltered stories and strategies from all around the world of government contracting. Join host Chelsea Roberts as she explores how to navigate, thrive, and win in this complex but lucrative industry.
Welcome to GovCon Unscripted. This is your host, Chelsea Roberts. Today's episode is a part of a series that we're calling Success After Service. We're featuring brilliant minds with wisdom to share from throughout the federal ecosystem, folks that served in the military and have transitioned out and found some success after their time, either in federal or military service. I hope that you enjoy this episode and the series, and if you haven't yet, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the podcast with your friends. All right. Hey, everyone, and welcome back to GovCon Unscripted. I'm your host, Chelsea Roberts, CEO of Collaborative Compositions. Today, I've got with us friend and colleague, Luke Shabro, founder, CEO of Wayfinder Strategies. Luke, who are you and what do you do?
Thank you, Chelsea, for having me. I'm just really excited to be here. I am a 40-year-old male that was born, I'm just kidding. No, I have worked throughout DoD or DOW my whole career. I started out 8 years Navy intelligence, so Navy veteran, and worked in, around the Army a whole lot and overall in the defense innovation space, and currently CEO and founder for Wayfinder Strategies. And so what I really do is work with companies and organizations that are looking to bring their solutions and their capabilities to the U.S. government, especially, again, the Department of War, and trying to help them navigate both as complex landscape and some of those treacherous areas and valley of death, and really help them understand and craft their message and translate so that they can actually communicate those awesome capabilities over to the DOW.
And that's something that you've been involved with for a really long time. And there's something that I just want to start out with a little brief conversation on is you were part of a very cool project and program, I guess I would call it, within the Army that's called the Mad Scientist Program. And I'm pretty sure that there's a bunch of people that have no clue that this exists. So why don't you give us a rundown of what that even is?
Yeah, absolutely. It was like, honestly, one of the funnest jobs I've ever had. And the Army Mad Scientist Initiative actually started in like 2008, 2009. It had started because there was an issue with IEDs. If everybody remembers at that time, we had popped up with this issue. I know you had Trish Martinelli, one of our fellow colleagues and friends, on here before talking about JIATO, and you had other organizations like WIC. I personally worked for one, the counterinsurgency targeting program that had previously been the counter ID program, and we saw billions of dollars spent on trying to up armor Humvees and deal with all this that was happening in Afghanistan and Iraq. And to be honest, the force just was not ready for this. And while it was addressed admirably, look at the damage and the casualties and the overall negativity caused by those IEDs. And the Army Training and Doctrine Command, TRADOC, that recently merged into T2COM, G2 at the time, Maxie McFarland, looked at that and was like, why are we surprised? Like, why was this a shock? Because you could go back all the way to Vietnam, looking at what was considered just booby traps at that time. You look at a lot of the conflict in the Balkans, and you saw similar type IEDs, not exactly the same, but this shouldn't have been a big surprise. And so what we wanted to do, what the Army wanted to do with Mad Scientist, was get left a bang. How do we start thinking about this differently? How do we stop just talking to ourselves? And in a way, Mad Scientist became the Army's first like futures think tank. And they started to bring in government folks that were scientists and engineers. So not just the warfighter, but bringing in those folks who were those scientific experts. And so they brought in folks, but it was typically from like the FBI, from NASA, from the intel community, bringing in folks from all over, but it was still primarily just government. And that was a really interesting time for Mad Scientists. And I actually went back and looked at all the reporting, and they were pretty close. And so what they were doing, though, was it was all classified. And so it was all self-contained. It never really permeated. And by the time the drawdowns happened and we were de-emphasizing out of OIF, OEF, they looked in and said, okay, we're shuttering the program. Served its purpose in a way. And so things fell to the wayside. And then TRADOC G2, which I should explain for the audience, that G2 is your intel chief basically for the Army. And the TRADOC G2 in 2015, Tom Greco, who I used to work for, looked at what was happening with Russia. This is before the full-scale invasion, but in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, what was happening in the Chinese Revolution in military affairs, the hybrid warfare we were seeing out of Syria. And there was a lot of thought that there is a changing character of warfare. Things are changing, and we are still thinking in a very counterinsurgency, counterterrorism mindset when we're seeing all these massive changes. So the nature of war was still the same, humanistic, focused around humans and by humans, but the character of warfare was changing, and the speed and the pace of battle was changing. So what he saw was a need, and I stole this and use it all the time. We have to disrupt ourselves before we're disrupted. And so that really necessitated, though, not being self-contained, but rather opening things up. And the Army Mad Scientist Initiative was a really unique program in that we worked a whole lot outside of just the Army. So what we started to do was include primary communities of, the first was, of course, still the government side, and we worked across all the sister services. We had a really strong relationship with the intelligence community, and then also with other departments like Department of State, Department of Treasury. Really wanted to get the broad swath of what was happening across the government, and especially as it related to disruptive and emerging technology and how that was going to impact overall the U.S. government, but especially our fighting forces. And then the second community was academia. And so we had a really strong relationship earlier on in Mad Scientist. What we were most known for at that time was conferences. And we would always partner with an academic institution like GTRI, University of Texas, Austin, Stanford. So we really wanted to partner with those academic institutions because they're researching not necessarily just for research's sake, but there wasn't a major profitability model in what they were doing. And so there were some unique niche research areas that we were able to get from them. And this is what I think impacts most with your audience, and what we're both working on in these days is with tech and industry and really understanding what was happening out there. And this is nothing against the defense primes, and they have their place, and obviously they're not going away anytime soon, but really we're looking out to the future, and we had to go to a lot of startups, those folks in the garages that were building this stuff out and trying to understand what was at the bleeding edge of technology. So what are those edge cases that are not necessarily widely proliferated, but we're starting to see earlier? And that's part of the horizon scanning that Army Mad Scientist was doing. And so I like to say some folks have a shoestring budget. We had a no string budget. We were walking around flip-flops because we had to just cobble everything together. So we didn't have pilots or initiatives in the sense of being able to fund things like through SBIR, things like that, or STTRs, nothing like that. What we had to do was be the connective tissue between all those areas. The Army itself and the DoD as a whole, especially in the mid 2010s, was really trying to figure things out. They were trying to understand there was all this momentum or all this excitement and buzz about, okay, we're innovating, we're doing all these things, but we were helping to map out. You see it a lot now, right? You can go and see products that are innovation ecosystem mapping, and people have it all over the place. But you were there 10 years ago, that didn't exist. And so we were really working hard to bring that together. And because we worked with all these different communities, we would then talk to the Navy, and they would say, we're working on this AI ML application that's focused on automated target recognition. And we'd say, great. We were just at the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab talking to them. They're working on something. Are you guys collaborating on this? No, we didn't even know that was happening. And so you had to then start to bring those folks together. So even though some people would look at it and be like, oh, okay, another idea factory, great. What we really did was act as that connective tissue. So we were very early on working with folks like NavalX, AFWorks, SoftWorks, as all those were standing up. That was really when Mad Scientist was coming into its own as well. And so we really provided again that networking to bring it all together. And so it was a super exciting time. And we've seen a lot come out of that as well, because a lot of the things that we were looking at, you're never going to predict the future, right? There was a professor at NDU that I used to interact with at War Games, and he would always say, point prediction is a sucker's bet. And if
Right.
I say, people are saying like, oh, we're going to have fully autonomous vehicles everywhere in 2030, you just can't do that. The convergence of all these different factors leads to too much ambiguity. But what you can do is not predict the future, but describe it. So what are some of the characteristics? And that was a big part of what Army Mad Scientists did, was the operational environment, or especially the future operational environment, and understanding what that future looks like in terms of the environment itself. There are certain characteristics and a lot of things, and I'm not saying this to say we were dead on or we were so right on everything, but there were a lot of areas where we said this massive proliferation of small to micro UAS was going to happen, that you
Right.
were going to start seeing this wide expansion of the Internet of Things, which continues to this day. And then we've seen all these things start to come to fruition, and that's all well and good. So, okay,
Right.
great. Like, we established the future OE, and this is what it potentially looks like. What's the point? The point is to then integrate so that you have capabilities that are written so that they actually address that future, and not just to go iteratively evolutionary from what you have now. So we're not, and again, no offense to anybody working on these programs, so that we're not on Abrams Block 62 that is just a wash, rinse, repeat and adding more stuff. We needed to really change the paradigm of how we were thinking that. And I think while I can't claim full success or all of the success was due to Mad Scientists, I do believe we contributed a ton to that. And that program is still going, and I think is going to be really critical as we've seen TRADOC and Army Futures Command merge back together to be T2COM. But there's this huge emphasis right now from the Department of War and the Department of Army on looking for what those gaps are and what those needs are, and not just now, but going out into the future. And so there's going to be a lot of importance placed, I think, on that program to look for what the signals are there.
So is Mad Scientist still going today?
Mad Scientist is still going today. And I used to co-host the Army Mad Scientists Convergence podcast. And my co-host, Matt Sanispert, is now in the position I was of deputy director over there, and still hosts that podcast. So they're still going. Actually, was just getting ready to share out today. They had a really interesting article from active duty service member who wrote on how China is trying to erode our technological capabilities, our advantage, and our overmatch. And unfortunately, we've been beating that drum for a while, but it's really important. And it matters for industry because there's going to be an intense focus on getting over that hump and to make sure we don't have that advantage eroded. My old boss, Lee Grubbs, director of Army Mad Scientists, and he's the ACE chief, or essentially the chief of analytics or analysis over at TRADOC G2 and now T2COM G2, always said that U.S. military technological advantage is not a birthright. And so we
Oh,
have to
yeah.
fight for it. And so they just put out this blog post recently. It's called the Mad Scientist Laboratory, is the blog that they have. And I think it's such like a critical aspect because you have to recognize what the problem is before you can address the problem. And if we just continue to go, yeah, okay, let's look for some capabilities. What we need to do is understand, what do we want that future end state to look like? And then we can build everything to make that happen.
That sounds like it's an incredibly valuable initiative and sounding like it's tried to break down and address some of the silos and the barriers between those silos, especially between the services. Have you seen that sort of connective tissue you were talking about has remained? Is that still something that folks are trying to actively maintain, that communication between services and between idea shops, if you will?
I gotta be honest, I think some of it has faded away.
Yeah,
And that's not just through mad scientists, but overall in the defense innovation ecosystem, there's
right.
been, I feel like, a little bit of revanchism to our foxholes and silos. And I think some of that is due to I've heard you talk about it, I've talked about it a bunch, the innovation theater aspect. And I think
Mm.
some people are just honestly exhausted and feel like, oh, okay, like we've tried this approach. And when it comes down to the rubber meeting the road, in actuality, then we get into our rice bowl fights over who's got what funding. I can't work on this jointly because they're then going to try and carve out portions of my budget to make this happen. And unfortunately, I feel like similar to the innovation hype cycle or just the tidal shifts, it ebbs and flows. And so I'm hopeful that with some of the changes that we're seeing right now from the acquisition memos that have come out from the Department of War and now from the services themselves, and this streamlining ostensibly of PEOs into PAEs and really trying to get that out there. I'm hoping some of that will change, and I'm eternally cautiously optimistic for how some of that stuff will change. But I think it also just comes back to, again, with that withdrawing back to the services, is there's also maybe an exhaustion be due to all the innovation organizations that stood up. I'm, of course, a fan, and I've worked for a number of them in different capacities. But the truth is, a lot of times when you stand up a big organization to address innovation, the innovation grinds to a halt. And I think, as a community overall, lost sight of how we achieve that innovation. And some of the best innovation that we saw was because it was bootstrapped, because we had to cobble things together. Like, necessity drives innovation. And once you stand up these massive organizations, you start to create the problem that you were trying to get around in the first place. You create more of the bureaucracy, more of the risk aversion. And so you need those outliers and mavericks to come in and, like, essentially disrupt things, which is why I always focus on positive disruption.
And there is such a thing as negative disruption that exists. And the more that you build onto something, the harder it is going to be to get that thing forward, to get that thing moving, and to keep that thing going. We see this in all the large defense primes where it's like the more that they add on to any given program, the more bureaucracy tags along with it, and the less they're actually able to accomplish.
Exactly. You look at the initial design and concept when it came to the F-35 in really the late 90s, and look at where we are now with that program. Again, no offense to my Joint Strike Fighter pilots and program specialists there, but it's become its own monster, just this behemoth that demands more funding and more programmatics around it instead of moving towards what the capability that you need is. You get focused on just perpetuating the program or the overall capability itself, but not addressing the actual needs.
And I think that there's something to be said about burning out the people that you're bringing into the process too. Because if you bring them into this big innovation theater and everybody's like under the impression that they're going to be making some massive change and it's going to be so instrumental to the future of warfighting, it's going to be instrumental to the next system, it's going to be fundamental to the change of all they want to see. And then you put them in this sort of institution that is basically just, okay, here, like you've got a flag, wave it whenever somebody says we've got innovation and ding a bell. And then they feel like, what did I just do that made an impact? Do you see folks getting that sort of sense of, like you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but do you feel like folks that are being put into these organizations are getting burned out faster?
I think so. And I say this as also a veteran of the innovation wars, in the sense
Yeah.
that You can go, we were both at AUSA, and I thought there was some great talks there, but it feels like overall, when you go to these defense conferences, even if innovation is in the name, you go and you feel like, okay, all right, here's the same speech I've heard for the last 8 to 10 years recycled. And I think people are going into this again, exactly as you said. I think overall people have the motivation and the intention to cause that positive change, to truly drive innovation. And I don't think very few people are coming in and going, yeah, like I want to put on innovation theater and all I really want to do is collect a check at the end of the day or be able to charge a customer for this, even though we're not really changing anything, but hey, we're slapping innovation on it. Very few people are actually doing that, but there are systemic issues that kind of cause that sometimes. And that's why I am more excited about some of the changes that could be happening. I am a little wait and see approach as well. It's more so don't give me the whole recipe, just show me the meal. And so
Yeah.
it's waiting to see what comes of that. But yeah, it's a burnout. And I felt that way plenty of times, even different periods where I've changed somewhat in my roles and then come back more so to defense innovation. And you feel a little bit like Sisyphus just pushing the boulder up the hill, waiting for it to roll back down on you. So
Yeah.
it can be exhausting, but I also try to remind myself and hopefully other people will remind themselves of why we're doing it. It's not just to say we're so edgy and innovative and fun. The idea is to truly innovate for the warfighter. And I think about that all the time. I served in uniform, but I was a Navy veteran on a ship and I never had a shot fired at me in anger. But I think about those warfighters on the edge and I think about the future force and what that looks like. My sons are 14 and 11 now, and one day they could be in uniform. And statistically, they're more likely to be in uniform than non veterans kids. And so I think about would I be proud of and okay with them serving in that future force? So I hope people remember that and that it's not just a process for process sake or something we're doing just to make money. And again, no bashing of the commercial side, but there is a lot of times a higher purpose to government work that I'm hoping will drive us forward.
That's definitely something that I feel personally passionate about is changing that dynamic from feeling like the only way that you can serve and the only way that you can help and contribute to solutions for the warfighter is to be a warfighter. And I think a lot of folks don't really necessarily think about themselves as being like a support to the service. And that's where I feel like I personally have a lot of passion and I drive a lot of my motivation comes from supporting that next generation of well-equipped and supported warfighter in the next conflict. And so I think that there's a lot of companies out there that don't have to necessarily be run by veterans, but there's plenty of them that really see the value in trying to tackle the federal government problems from outside of the federal government. I think that's been a big shift for me, seeing as many companies stand up and say, I had this problem when I was in active
Yeah.
duty, and I absolutely feel like I can solve this from the outside, and I have a better chance of solving it from the outside. And oftentimes, I feel like one of their first places to go is like the SIBR program, which is the Small Business Innovative Research
Yeah.
Program. And I feel like a lot of them take time to like just get well entrenched into that program, but I'm not sure that they see many ways out of it. And I think that's been a constant problem for folks, which is the valley of death problem. How
Yep.
have you seen that problem is changing? Are there solutions that are out there to help companies get through that? What are your thoughts on
I
that?
I think it's changing. I'm impatient and I would like
Yeah.
to see it change more and faster. So I think the Valley of Death still very much exists. And I know a lot of the audience is familiar with it, but really you look at that Valley of Death happening, you're in that TRL or your technology readiness level, you're in those RD, T&E phases where you're in research and development, you're not quite ready for showtime. And then you have the programmer record side, and you're really at the very least getting to TRL 8 plus essentially. And in between, what are you supposed to do? And I know SIBR is, I'm still a huge fan of the SIBR program that it provides that opening. I don't look at it as what I advise companies against and hope companies remember is don't use cyber as your long-term plan. It's just not. And what it provides is another pathway, a way to come in and show the value that you can provide, and also offers some pathways a lot of times to sponsorship for different things, whether it's getting that authorization to operate or ATO, all these different areas where you can do more of that experimentation and get there and show your capabilities. But then what? And I think AppFit's a really interesting program, but I think it's really sometimes the messaging has been conflicting coming out, and
Yeah.
it's gone from, okay, sometimes you have this capability and what we're going to help you with is scalability in that, to sometimes it's like you basically need to be like this close to a program of record in order to get there. And that's frustrating. But what I've seen in terms of the commercial solutions openings and a lot of the CSOs and some of the other initiatives that have taken place is really interesting. And I think we could see some acceleration, but again, it gets down to the devil being in the details. Like, very much, again, I had pretty much no qualms at all with the acquisition reform memos that have come out and the orders.
Right.
However, I really want to see how that takes place, because we saw it. And again, if I can slander my own environment, I worked for Army Futures Command, and back to our conversation before, there was a lot of really positive and really hopeful and hardworking people that wanted to make things happen. But the reason that Army Futures got merged back together with TRADOC and some other components is there wasn't enough when the rubber met the road. And
Right.
it was this idea, this concept that could have, I think, really taken off. And I think that in actuality, it has to be about how are you changing the functions? How are you changing the culture? Not just a org chart reshuffle. Because if you don't change where authorities lie, if you don't change how the requirements process works, if you don't change all of that, then what you get is, for example, the 13 Army PEOs that are collapsing into 6 PAEs. If you don't change how that process and how those authorities work, then what's going to happen is you're just going to have those mismatched among different PAEs. And it's going to be the same people doing the same thing, just under a different title and a different organizational spot. And so I really am hopeful for folks to get over the valley of death. And some of that is going to be on us in industry and even in the business development, government contracting space to get people there. I used to love to use it all the time, but I've seen it on LinkedIn so many times as a trope. I don't really use it anymore. But from Ender's Game, like, no one is coming to save you. And so we can't have industry relying on the fact that things are going to change and get dramatically better when it comes to the valley of death. We have to help them maneuver their way around this so that they can get there, because at the end of the day, you can't wait. And honestly, if you look at program implementation, yeah, okay, we're shifting around the PEOs to get PAEs who supposedly will have more authorities and be more connected to the requirement side, this faster OODA loop on the cycle of decision making. But that's going to take some time itself. Those things don't happen overnight, and we might not see the true impacts of that change or intended change for at least a year, maybe a year and a half, even 2. Companies can't sit and wait and go, okay, great, like, they're changing all this and it's going to be for the positive, and it might be, and I hope it is, but we can't wait for that, because I don't think it's going to happen in the timeline people are expecting, despite how fast the Department of War leadership wants to move.
Yeah, especially this year. I think that we're all in this interesting quagmire of having all of this sort of change thrust upon us, but without actually seeing any of it implemented. So that's one of my definite curiosity areas is, are we going to see this change? When are we going to see it? What's it going to look like? How is this
Yeah.
going to actually be impacted and affected and implemented in ways that are going to be of benefit? Because it, from my understanding, I guess, the government's never really done a PAE. What does that look like? It's portfolio of capabilities. You could say that. And in concept, it sounds really great. But how are you going to break the folks out of their routine habit of having their own individual silo, of going back to their foxholes and their silos and saying, hey, I just need to do this for myself. This is the only reason. I don't have any need to do this for anybody else or any other reason. And how are they going to build into this working ecosystem or the infrastructure a sort of a sense for common goals, a sense for common accomplishment, and a sense for collaboration amongst the services? Personally, I'm an eternal optimist though, so take this for what you will. I'm like, they're going to do great. It's going to be really easy. Everybody's going to have no trouble breaking out of their old habits and fashions, and they're just going to come like swinging through the doors together, and they're going to break down all these walls together. But I think we still have a little ways to go. There's probably a little bit of time before we actually see that going smoothly or flowing well.
Absolutely. And all this came out, and folks in the government, we're recording on November 14th, folks in the government just came back into the office. So we have folks just coming back in. So nobody's even had time to assert their will, dig their heels in, and say, no, we're not complying. Not in the sense that they wouldn't comply with orders that happen, but you can change just enough to not really change. So you can change enough to meet what you've been ordered to do in the government, but not have that true, substantial, foundational change. But I will agree with you on the optimist side of that's why I have this sign, right? Everything is figure outable. And really, where there's a will, there's a way. And so I worry about the grind of trying to make that happen. But at the same time, we also have incredibly capable people of making it happen. And a lot of times, your mavens who are your positive disruptors in this community will drag it across if they have to. And there's always a way to make it happen. And the biggest thing on the industry side is to try and remain resilient as possible. And that's not dig into your foxhole and just stay there as things are changing, but you have to future-proof yourself and become adaptable to what's going to happen. If you are stuck on the model of how business is currently done, then you're going to be in the dust as it does change. And it will change. It's just a matter of how that change manifests.
Yeah, definitely. And who's there to contribute to it, and who's decided that's not worth their time because they're so rigidly in their fixed mindset. And I think that's a common thing. I'm hoping we'll see that sort of start to transition and turn over, and the folks that aren't going to contribute to the solution aren't sitting there contributing to the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why they call it the frozen middle, right?
Yeah.
This is through mad scientists, through the work I've done throughout the Army and DOW, and with Wayfinder Strategies. That's why you have to have, in a sense, with your engagement, this multi-pronged approach, because you can sit there and say, this senior leader loves our capability, and okay, great. But if you have a frozen middle, which sometimes we do, because the system rewards you for sticking with the status quo. It's just true. Right. Nobody ever gets fired for doing something new. If you do, right? Nobody ever gets fired for sticking with the status quo. If you rock the boat, you could be having issues. And so that's why you get that frozen middle. And if I'm in the frozen middle and a senior leader comes and says, I'm really excited about this new initiative, and I just saw this new capability, and we absolutely need this, and it could be based on doctrine and requirements and everything else. And then the frozen middle goes, yeah, okay, cool. He's got another good idea, or she's got another good idea. The good idea fairy's been sprinkling stuff all over. Let's just ride this out. And that frozen middle is more often going to be longer there, and they'll just ride it out until the next person comes in and does it all again. And then if you get that bottom up approach, you just don't a lot of times have the juice to push it up to actually get to acquired, procured, getting not even just into programs of record, but to get into any of these purchases, you don't have enough juice to get there. And so you actually have to hit it from all three levels and the outside as well, and really influence, because otherwise you're going to get lost at one of those layers. And unfortunately, as much as we might like it to be more of a flat organization and don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of team of teams and everything else, but at at the same time, the reality is there are echelons and there are chains of command. And so you have to, in a positive way, influence and really start to spread that message so that you can get it there. Because you might have the best technology. You're coming out and everything looks amazing, and you start believing your own hype and everything you have. But if you don't get through that, you don't get through it. And at the end of the day, anybody at any of these levels can love your technology. But at the end of the day, if you don't get there, it was all just words.
Exactly. Exactly. And that kind of brings me to what I'll call our last question here. And if you had to give a fantastic, sort of edgy, startup-y like company any sort of just tips, if you had a piece of advice to hand along to the next X Tech winner or the next SIBR round of applicants, what would that advice be?
Yeah, so this is not a popular term these days. There's a lot of people that are not okay with it or maybe even see it as weakness, but use empathy. Honestly, that is to me the most critical piece because you have to use empathy to understand what the warfighter's mission is, what they need, and what are they facing. And it can be tough, right? Like you want to shout at whatever brigade commander or whatever decision maker that's there that isn't making the time to listen to your pitch or isn't really all that interested, but you have to empathize and remember like they have a lot of times millions to billions of dollars under their purview, and more importantly, a lot of times they have soldiers' lives or service members' lives under their purview that they are responsible for. And so those responsibilities weigh heavy, and they have to focus on what's most important, which is the mission and the warfighter or the service member. You have to use empathy to understand that and put yourself in so that you can actually tell the story, not as this is my really cool widget that's out there, but rather this is what's going to make your life better. This is what's going to make your mission better. This is what's going to make you more lethal, effective, all these things. And then you also have to empathize with your contracting officers who are overwhelmed, understaffed, dealing with all this stuff. How do you empathize with them and not just come across as the whiny contractor who's trying to hawk their stuff? And then also turning around to empathizing with those program managers and those program offices and understanding the incredible amount of pressure that they're under. And so you have to use empathy across all these levels to understand where people are coming from so that you can meet them where they're at. And that's, to me, the biggest thing. And I can say that having been in tech competitions, receiving these pitches, and there's a big difference between the ones you can tell have thought that through and utilize that strategic empathy to understand and apply that to their technology or their solution, and the ones who haven't really thought that through. And I don't think most of the time it is almost never anything malicious or anything purposefully neglectful. It's just if you're coming from outside of these organizations, you don't think about that on a regular basis a lot of times. But that's what I would tell them is just use that empathy because it's a superpower.
I love that. Empathy is a superpower. That is powerful. And I think that it's so often forgotten. Folks don't just even take into consideration the fact how much they have to do during a given day, let alone what their government counterpart or their government customer might have to do in a day, especially after they come back from things like government shutdowns that lasted 6 weeks, right?
Exactly.
It's the email pile that these folks are coming back to has to just be crushing. I can't even imagine it.
Bananas. I just saw a great post on LinkedIn yesterday where somebody recommended if you're reaching out to your government customer or POC, go ahead and email them, but just say in the email, hope you're doing great. Welcome back. Hit me up when you're dug out, because if you try and demand out of them right now, I was there, I was government, and you come back, and luckily I was fortunate not to be impacted by the shutdown, but good God, even leaving for a conference or being out on PTO for 5 days, you come back and the pile is enormous and the work has not stopped while you're gone in terms of what's been coming onto you. doubly for the folks in government right now because all that stuff is piling up, not only as regular operations went, but rather the stuff that was supposed to be happening, people are ready to beat down their doors. So you just have to understand to be patient with them and walk that fine line between being persistent, but not being annoying.
Yeah, being persistent versus being a pain. That tends to be the problem.
Give them some space, wait a couple days, try again, and give them some space.
Yeah, exactly. This has been a fantastic conversation, Luke. For folks who want to get a hold of you to talk more about all of the things that we covered, innovation, mad scientists, all of the things, how can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, folks can find me on LinkedIn, just my name, Luke, Shabro. Also for Wayfinder Strategies, we're wayfinderstrategies.tech. And so folks can reach out to me there, and I have all sorts of contact information. Love talking to folks and just try to help anywhere I can because I love to hear stories also.
I love it. Folks, reach out to Luke. Follow him on LinkedIn if you don't already. He's fantastic, very prolific writer. He's got a lot of thought pieces he puts out there and a great voice in the industry. Thanks, everyone.
You're too kind, Chelsea. Thank you.
Thanks for coming on today, Luke, first of all. And thanks, everyone, for listening in today to this episode of GovCon Unscripted. Don't forget to share, subscribe, and share it with your friends. And if you've got the time or an opportunity, leave a review. Put it out there on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. That helps us get out to more folks and to a wider audience. And we appreciate all of you listening, and we appreciate you too, Luke. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Chelsea.
Thanks for listening to this episode of GovCon Unscripted with your host, Chelsea Roberts. Do you have a GovCon story or need guidance in government contracting? Connect with Chelsea on LinkedIn to be a guest on the show or to enhance your business strategy. Don't forget, your network is your net worth. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with your growing GovCon community.